I love both of our next speakers. Our plenary is using brain science for a path forward, and I'd love to invite Dr. Ann Light and Dr. Michael Hanna to the front. Dr. Light is a pediatrician trained at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Light has worked in clinical settings, run a nonprofit geared towards increasing early brain development, and served as the medical director for Social Services Agency of Orange County. And she has a particular interest in brain plasticity and growth. And Dr. Michael Hanna is a professor of neuroscience right here at Vanguard University. He must be really good at the bubble thing because he says yes every single time. And we're going to have them just tag team, and then we'll ask questions. So Dr. Light will go first, and then Dr. Hanna. And Dr. Hanna's expertise, he teaches on neuroscience, neurobiology of learning and memory, research in neuroscience, biological psychology, addiction studies, and principles of learning. And so I'm really happy to welcome them both. And Dr. Light, I'll ask you to go first. Do you want to sit or stand? Yes.
Sandy knows me well. We're wiggly people, or at least I'm very wiggly, so I like to be able to stand. So thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be with you, and this is always a fun talk because it allows me to bring out my inner Pollyanna. And we spend so much time talking about a lot of really heavy stuff that's really important. But I think it's also important to think about, as Dr. Morgan said, the way forward and how we can make this better. So thank you so much, and I'm not sure. I don't think I have a clicker. Does someone have a clicker where they're going to advance for me? Wonderful. Thank you. Who am I looking at? Okay, I'll just give you a thumbs up when it's time to go to the next one. Awesome. All right, so the title of this is Rebuilding the Brain After Trauma. And I'm Ann Light, MD. I have no financial disclosures. I was previously employed by the County of Orange, but I actually now do independent consulting work. And I have no affiliation with any products or services listed in this talk. All right, so we're going to do three brief things. We're going to do a quick review of brain basics, just to kind of get everybody on the same page. We're going to talk quickly about the brain's response to trauma, which I know many of you have learned about in other places and could be a whole other talk on its own. And then we're going to talk about creating a new baseline, so how we get where we're going. All right, so I like this slide. I like to think of your brain as the ultimate weapon. We tend to think of brains as this very static kind of little sack of neurons in our head, but in fact, it's more plastic or as plastic and as changeable as our bodies. And just like our bodies, it evolves and changes over our lives, or maybe evolves in the road, but it changes over our lives to support us in navigating our environment. So back when I went to med school back in the dark ages, we really thought, you were itty bitty and your brain got bigger and it developed a certain way and it got to its biggest at 25 and then you slowly shriveled and died. And we really thought, as Hantina said, it was sort of a eat your lucky charms thing where just as you got bigger, it got bigger, like your bones get bigger. But in fact, brain development really depends on use. It's much more plastic than other parts of the body. And so the size, the shape, the pathways, they're constantly changing. Early experiences are often the most powerful, right? Because it's a very actively growing brain. But use it or lose it will apply to every part of the cortex at every stage of life, okay? So the more trauma in your life, the more dangerous your environment, the more you develop the skills to be reactive to it, that's adaptive, and the more stable and peaceful your life, the more you're encouraged to be thoughtful and quiet, the more you develop those skills as well. All right, so this is just a comparison, again, to think about the body and the brain is very similar. If I go to the gym every day and I do bicep curls, I'm going to have really big biceps, and it's going to help me carry my groceries, right, or do whatever physical tasks I need to do. If I'm maltreated in any way, okay, I'm going to actually grow a bigger amygdala. I'm going to grow pathways that help me become more responsive. that help me run away faster, that help me fight. And we think of that sometimes as a negative thing, but it's actually really adaptive, right? If you're a little 6-year-old and you're in a house that is not safe, or if you're a girl being trafficked, you need to read your aggressor carefully. You need to know how to get out of bad situations and how to do it quickly. Deep thinking isn't going to help you. Moving the blood from the front of your brain to your heart, to your lungs, to your big muscles, which is what this amygdala does, gets you out of danger faster and is adaptive and protective. All right, so in one slide, which is frozen so you can't see it, sorry. If you put your right hand up, we'll just do it this way. Everybody right hand up? Up, okay. Fold your thumb inside and your fingers on the top. That thumb is the amygdala. It's the deep area of the brain that's going to really regulate emotion. And the fingers are the cortex on top that does some deep thinking. And what's going to happen in trauma is your thumb's going to get really big, and your fingers are going to kind of get spindly and spread apart. I apologize. There was supposed to be some animation that appears to not be working on this. So the brain's response to trauma, again, getting into sort of the nitty-gritty, you increase that deep structure, the fight, flight, freeze, and the rapid emotional response, rapid cortisol secretion in a time of danger. And you actually get decreased growth and even neuronal death in the frontal. So you can actually bathe the neurons that live up here in a petri dish with some cortisol, and they'll still die off, which is what we often see in growing brains. And what you also see is less crosstalk between the regions. So where, ideally your brain is really wired, it's not a wireless connection, it's wired, the neurons need to touch each other to function, you start to see a breakdown of those connections, okay, in trauma. And just what I want to highlight, and you can't totally see both slides, but the one on top is from a popular website, and the quote is, "How abused and neglected children grow into broken adults." And I think there's this bias in our community, right, that if you went through bad stuff when you were little, your brain is wrong, and there's something wrong with you. And we think about it as very final. And I think that's so interesting because I come from a military family. My brother-in-law's in the Marines, and a cousin is in the Navy. And when we see them and their service, right? Both of them have gone abroad to Afghanistan and Iraq. Both of them have been in wars. Both of them have been in combat situations where there was a lot of death, and they came back with fast reaction times, right? My daughter had a balloon pop at her party, and my brother-in-law hit the ground. And everyone says, "Wow, thank you for your service. Wow, you're an amazing sniper. You were a grown man, and you went to Afghanistan, and you developed these rapid reaction times and these skills. We call them skills because your brain adapted to being in Afghanistan, and you come back and we expect you to reintegrate." And so I just want to kind of plant the seed now, and I'll come back to it later. It's all one brain, right? It's not that abused kids are broken and military people are heroes. It's that our brain is always changing, and when we go into a traumatic environment, we build structures to rapidly respond to danger. That's what we're supposed to do. And so whether you're a little kid or a veteran, the goal is to make sure as you come back to a safer environment that you're able to, again, rebuild or change your brain to what's going to be most adaptive in this moment as the moment changes. Okay. And again, nothing's permanent except change. Heraclitus said that many, many centuries ago, and it's still true. Again, we accept as a society that behavior shapes your body. That's, I felt comfortable putting up there because Jillian Michaels has sort of made a career out of this, right? She openly shares. She used to be quite overweight. She changed her behavior very dramatically, and it changed how she physically looks. It changed her muscles. It changed the amount of fat, right? It probably changed the size and shape of things like her liver, because believe it or not, how you weigh changes your internal organs, her omentum. Your brain is the same way. If you change your behavior, not all, it wasn't one salad that did that for Jillian Michaels. It was years of hard work. But if you work on it, your brain will change over time. All right, so rebuilding the brain after trauma, like building muscle, it's not easy. It takes time. But as we're sitting here, for I think an hour and a half, you're with Dr. Hannah and I, you'll get 1.5 billion new cells, billion with a B. Okay, so every hour you get 1 billion cells, and they'll go where you use them, in your body and in your mind. So if you're doing bicep curls, they're going to go one place. If you are like me and it's Thanksgiving and you're face down in a pecan pie, they're going to go somewhere else. And that's okay, right? But your brain and your body both have that reaction. So new activities, new situations can build strengths in weak brain areas. And again, if you have been in a traumatic situation, if you have built a strong amygdala and that high cortisol response is causing you more stress and more grief now, and you'd like to kind of rebuild the frontal lobes, we can do that over time. So, lots of ways to do this. This is just a slide of one that I love. Again, you bicep curl, you get a big bicep. It's easy to carry things. If you meditate a lot, you actually develop an area of the brain. I like to call it the super brain. Dr. Hanna probably could give the full name, but it's a little more complex. But there are actually areas of the brain that you can increase the density of neurons and thus the functionality on a scale of like 1,000,000 to 1 when you meditate. And that is part of what helps draw blood out of the amygdala. It's part of what helps you rebalance and manage stressful situations in life. All right, and what's really cool is this can happen really quickly, okay? So this is, again, a super brain, let's call it, example, but it's a study with meditation in the prefrontal cortex. And what they did is they took, I think, a couple hundred people, I don't remember the exact number, and over 4 days, they had 30 hours. So it was a controlled trial and randomized. They randomized you to either sit in a room like this and hear about meditation for 30 hours and how great is it, and maybe go home and do some homework and try it, or to actually meditate together for 30 hours over 4 days. So quite a bit of meditation. But what was fascinating is if you look, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at that intervention, the dark blue, and again, the animation isn't quite working, but the dark blue area is more or less the amount of cortisol that was secreted before the 4-day trial. So they took the people who were going to be in the meditation group, they gave them a stressor before, and they saw what their cortisol did. And it was in spit. It wasn't super, that part wasn't traumatic for them. And then afterwards, that light blue is actually the line of afterwards. And so if you look at it, they're secreting about 1/3 the amount of cortisol. That means their brain is bathed in 1/3 as many stress hormones. That means their heart, their liver, their kidneys, all the organs of their body, right, are not actually seeing the same stress level. And to Dr. Sorrell's point, we like to think of ourselves as thinking animals, and we are, but biology is huge, right? And if your heart is pounding, if you're having trouble breathing, it's hard to make calm, easy decisions. And so the degree that we can decrease cortisol production, you can really start to change how we respond to situations. All right, so rebuilding the brain after trauma, there are a whole bunch of ways to do it. One is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll have these written out on the separate slides, but it was a lot of words for the overview. One is EMDR. One is meditation. We talked a little bit about that. We'll talk more. Exercise, safe and supportive experiences, which is to say, as Dr. Stratman and Dr. Sorrells were talking about, having somebody you trust going in, building relationships, that helps. And I'm going to talk about medication as an adjunct. All right, so what's trauma-focused behavioral therapy? Can I show a show of hands? Is this something people are familiar with? Raise your hand if you know. Okay, like half and half. Awesome. So forgive me, those who know. Again, everything here is simple because I got 20 minutes to do a lot. But the major steps really include educating about trauma impact and working on some of those relaxation skills, but again, really meditation and changing the brain, emotion modulation and management, which again is really kind of getting at cortisol levels in the brain, and then doing some critical analysis and trauma narration. And what's really cool is when you break it down, we're going to bomb through really quickly, what we see is that every single part of that actually rehabilitates a part of the traumatized brain. So next slide, please. So what you see is when you look at that relaxation, stress management, affective modulation, emotional management, again, you're actively finding ways to kind of shrink that thumb, and you're actively finding ways to build that super brain, which is going to pull blood flow away from the thumb and start to rewire. Next slide, please. Trauma narration and analysis of trauma is going to kind of grow the fingers, grow those critical lobes, and actually tighten the fist. What do we mean by tighten the fist? Well, usually what happens with trauma is, again, the amygdala, the emotional center, gets really big, and it will actually suck the blood flow away from the frontal lobes. It's called amygdalar hijack, and it's basically like good luck thinking. You're not getting any sugar, you're not getting any oxygen, all the blood flow is gone out of the front of the brain. It's why almost every single one of us in this room has probably made a bad decision on a bad day. And I'm not talking epically bad. I'm talking an extra glass of wine, an extra thing of chocolate cake. I snapped at my daughter the other day because I was done with life, right? That kind of mistake. I didn't think through this is a good thing to say, but it came out. In case those were wondering, she wouldn't stop sweeping. I don't know why. And I said, if you don't stop sweeping right now, I'm going to take the broom away forever. Yes, right? Not my frontal lobe talking. It was I was hungry, I was tired, I was exhausted, I was done. We needed to go home. So it really helps you tighten the fist so that you can start to say, okay, I am hungry, I'm overwhelmed, but you know what? I've got this frontal lobe to say, hey, honey, great sweeping. How about I reward you by stopping at Wendy's on the way home, and we'll both get food now, okay? So you can sort of use that to think through. This is where unfortunately, animation is going to be a big problem because this was supposed to come up after we read all about eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This was the summary. But let's just say it's a really cool therapy where fundamentally what's happening is you're thinking about the trauma that you have endured, unfortunately, and at the same time, you're thinking about it. You're following the therapist's finger with your eyes. Okay, now the first time I heard about that, this is the what, how is that possible, right? How does thinking about it help you? And I'm moving my eyes, so what? Well, it turns out as you look into it more deeply, not only is it proven to work, so people like the Department of Defense are on board, and they do not buy into woo-woo lightly, right? They like that very well validated. But actually, again, it's shrinking the thumb, and it's connecting the fingers. And next slide, let's see, I might have it. Oh, good. I do have it written down bit by bit. Okay, so the initial focus is on building safety, but also kind of shrinking that thumb, shrinking the amygdala, decreasing the cortisol. And then again, you're remembering the traumatic events, and you're following the clinician's finger. So that seems weird, right? So I'm remembering traumatic events. Well, again, when you remember traumatic events, your amygdala activates. Yeah? Okay, your amygdala activates. You feel a stress response, and the blood flow leaves the front of your brain. But when you start following something with your eyes, as simple as that sounds, you're using your occipital lobe to see where the finger is, right? You're thinking about where it's going next. You don't watch it and then, oh, I missed it. Wait, where did it go? You're predicting where it's going to go. And that's actually, even though it's not a hugely complex function, it is bringing blood into the frontal parts of your brain as you're at the same time processing your trauma. And so it's helping to kind of rebalance the blood flow in the brain. Mindfulness meditation, it's really cool. I gotta be honest, I don't really love it. I like it less than bicep curls. But I still do it because it's incredibly valuable. And so really what it does is it does change your brain over time. And so what you see is this increased development of the frontal lobes, increased networking, okay? Oops, I think we went. And then that was my fault. I gave a thumbs up. I'm sorry. I was sticking out. And then it actually works in direct opposition to traumatic events. Okay, so now next slide. So there are lots of different types. Ironically, as somebody who loves the brain and is a total geek, people ask me, what's the best type? And I'm like, oh, it's the type that builds the prefrontal cortex. They're like, yeah, okay, what type is that? So the reality is there are a lot of different ways to do it, and what really matters is how your brain is responding. On a neurological level, again, what you're trying to do is pull the blood flow to the front of the brain. This is really cool. Okay, so let's say I want to plant a garden, okay? I've got a lot of weeds in my house, and I want to plant some kale. So I make a little nice area, and I put in the kale seeds. What else do I have to do? Shout it out. It's after lunch. We're tired. Water it, right? If I'm over here watering the weeds, and the kale's over there, I got nothing, right? Okay, so blood flow's like water. Blood flow brings oxygen. It brings nutrients to your brain. You need it. And so when we talk about that 1 billion new cells, they don't all thrive. Some of them do great, but they're like seeds. Some of them die off. And so what you water is what grows. And so the really cool thing about meditation is, in this picture, blue is decreased blood flow, so very decreased from the baseline. Red is increased, and the red and blue is decreased in some areas and increased in the others. And so this slide was actually by people who were super into automatic self-transcending, transcendental meditation. I don't take away that much detail, but just, again, the point of meditation is to take the blood flow away from your amygdala, give it to that frontal lobe so that the 1 billion new cells in your body, the ones that are crawling around up here, get the water they need to really dig in and set up shop, and that makes a difference over time. Okay, this is, again, we talked a little bit about this. It's not super clear on the picture, but there's sort of a dark gray brain on a background, and there's a logarithmic scale on the bottom, and what you're seeing on the left is a brain that hasn't done meditation, and on the right that has, and that deep yellow is showing you that that area has like 1 to 10 million times more neurons in someone who's been meditating regularly. So again, that area of the brain becomes highly developed and again can help to regulate the blood flow to the amygdala and decrease amygdala hijack and cortisol secretion. All right, exercise. Exercise is a great thing to do. It releases molecules that help new neurons grow and develop. Going back to that garden analogy, anything else I might want to do for my kale in addition to water? What if I planted it in my glorious California clay soil? How happy is it going to be? No. What else does it need? Nutrients, fertilizer, compost, or manure, or Miracle-Gro, whatever you want to call it. So there's this cool thing called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It increases threefold after exercise. I like to think of it as Miracle-Gro for the brain. Again, it's something that kind of helps neurons dig in and get happy where they are, okay? And it's thought to be one of the reasons that actually you get increased neurogenesis, you make more nerve cells in the brain and have better functionality in the context of exercise. So when you're exercising regularly, your brain is growing better. Higher intensity and duration is ideal. So a lot of the studies are 1 hour so hard you can't talk. I remember the last time I worked out 1 hour so hard I couldn't talk. It was a long time ago. I think my daughter's turning 10, so maybe 11 years. But, if you can do half an hour really hard, if you can do an hour moderately, the more you do is better, again, because the more you do, the more you're going to make this Miracle-Gro for the brain, and it's going to start setting up shop. It can be interesting in trauma. It can be harder to do, but also more important. Why do I say that? It's harder to do because let's say I go for a run. The first thing that happens, especially as out of shape as I am today, my heart starts beating fast, right? It's hard to breathe. Maybe if I'm going at night, my eyes are starting to dilate. What does that feel like? What might that remind somebody who's been through trauma of? Fear, right? It's almost like a fear response. And so that can be really hard for people who've been through trauma to feel that sweaty, shaky, heart going fast, hard to breathe feeling. But for the right person, if you can get to the other side, it can also be reassuring, right? Because you get to the point where you realize, wait a minute, my heart's beating fast, my lungs are breathing fast, but I'm not in danger. I'm on a treadmill at the gym. This 24-hour fitness is a safe space. So you are able to start to kind of separate that feeling of danger from danger itself, which becomes useful because then the next time you go to the supermarket and somebody gives you a look and you get shaky and sweaty, and you might think that doesn't happen, but as somebody who had a fun A score as a kid, I can tell you I'll still have reactions to things, but I can go, oh, okay, wait a minute. This is just my heart, this is just my lungs. I'm not actually in danger, okay? And so it can kind of help you overcome, separate out, again, not only decrease the amygdala function, but separate out when your amygdala is acting up from when you're actually in danger, because they're not always the same thing. Oh man, another overlay. Okay, so my take on psychotropic medication, and actually to Dr. Sorrell's point, this I think actually applies to group holes as well. So psychotropic medication and group homes, they're inhumane to deny it to somebody who could benefit. It's inhumane to give it to someone to mask symptoms of a deeper problem. Okay, and treatment's going to be the same for treatment's going to be different for every single person. Okay, so clear as mud, right? And so I always ask people, what would you want for yourself, or what would you want for your child? And so this is my analogy. This is a leg. This is if I hopefully don't fall off the stage and I land on my right ankle. That's what it looks like. Actually, that's a left leg, left ankle. What's happened? What are we going to do? Okay, yes, you might want to try to put a cast on it, right? Because what do you see? It's really broken, right? And I noticed someone up front here said surgery, because you're right, that thing is not it's casting going to fix that. Okay, so we got some people who can do surgery, or maybe it's my poor friend Dr. Hannah who falls and breaks his ankle. I can do surgery. I did it in Haiti. We had very little anesthesia. It sucked, but we did it, okay? So he's fallen, he needs surgery, so each of you is going to grab a limb and hold him down, right? And I'll get my scalpel, and we'll fix it. How's that going to go? Is that going to be good? He's running away. No, why? Why not? What's the problem? Okay, true, we don't have the proper, let's say I had the proper equipment. I got a lot of stuff in my car, you'd be surprised. I'm an emergency room physician, my husband's a paramedic, so like I legit have Narcan in there should anyone need it, just in case. That's how I roll. What else? Any other problems? You were running away. Why were you running away? You don't want to be in pain. That would hurt like a mother, right? And then I get a scalpel and we're tugging at it. That's not going to be fun. Okay, so I don't want you to be in pain either. So I've got an idea. Let's forget surgery. I'm just going to do a bucket of oxycodone. Harder to get, but I'll make it work, okay? And I'll just give it to you. And I'll be like, here's your bucket. Have a good life. How's that going to work out for him? No, why not? We didn't fix the problem, okay? So people like to think about medication. People like to think about group homes. They like to think about it as a solution. It's not. It's a way to get you to the solution, right? The thing we need to do is help people rewire their brains. But we need to recognize, just like surgery on the body, that can be painful. Talking about your trauma, reliving what you've been through, that's a lot, okay? So I would say be very quick to give people support like medication and like extra therapy, but remember that it is an adjunct to get them where they need to go, okay? Even the Department of Defense actually has some really interesting new studies. It's not approved in the general population, but they tried giving blood pressure medications to folks who are undergoing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And they did this because they found a lot of people who are undergoing that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, that's when you have to actually talk about what you've been through, not just follow something with your eyes, so it's like very tough for people to go through. And what they found is that when they dosed them for 12 weeks, so the week you started TFCBT to the week you ended, you got blood pressure meds for 12 weeks, and then you stopped. And it was 3 to 4 times more successful than folks who didn't have the medication. These were people with blood pressure issues. We weren't going to just put them on a blood pressure med for the rest of their days, but it was a medication to help them get through the rewiring of the brain, which can be every bit as hard as fixing that ankle, okay? All right, so healing after the brain after trauma, we talked about this. You got to address the trauma, build the prefrontal cortex fundamentally, decrease the amygdala function, and you want to expose to healthy courses of cortisol opposition. That basically means you want to meditate, you want to exercise, you want to do things that are going to burn off cortisol and decrease its production. We talked about building the superbrain through meditation, build social areas of the brain and connection to other people, and then again, medication as needed. So specifically, you got opiate addiction, please, please, please give them Suboxone, give them, methadone's a little older now, but give them something. Try to treat anxiety or depression. People want to say it's either trauma or it's anxiety or depression. Often it's all of it, okay? And so again, treating the anxiety or depression is not the only thing you want to do. You want to help them through trauma, but you may need to treat them to get them to the point where they can get out of bed, right, and come into the therapist and talk through their issues, because that is really, really hard. And then again, medication, think about it as a way to assist the therapeutic rewiring. It's not forever, right? And again, thinking back to our example with veterans that I like to point out in military families, no one would expect someone who goes to war and comes back and is having nightmares to say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have any medication, just suck it, right? Or here's medication, we're never gonna treat your therapy. So same deal. Right? We got to give them what they need to get to where they need to be. And it's just as doable in kids as it is in veterans, and we need to work on both groups. And lots of references. Thank you, guys.
No worries. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit differently. So let's go to the next slide. Let's see if it works. Okay, animation is gone. Okay, but that's okay. I want you guys to do me a favor. Tell me, is the word capitalized or not? First one. No. How about no? Yes, okay. Does the word rhyme with snoring, imploring? How about bearing? Okay. So then tell me if either of these words fit into the sentence. The girl put the painting on the table. The girl put the road on the table. No. Okay. Good. Next slide. So what I'm kind of interested in is how to improve memory. So a lot of my research is how to improve memory as well as erase memory. So a lot of times, both with students, I deal a lot of times also with youth, they struggle with learning and memory. So how can we use what we know about the brain to help improve memory? So that's kind of what I'll be talking about. So I'm actually going to also talk about the amygdala, but I'm actually going to talk about it in a good way. All right? So it's good. Yeah, exactly. So if you think about it, right, which type of memories do we tend to remember the most? The bad ones or the good ones? What's common between them? Heightened emotions. Exactly. So here's the interesting thing, right? So for the longest time, everyone knows the hippocampus. Hippocampus is the main structure that's involved in memory. Well, the amygdala is connected to the hippocampus. And what ends up happening is every time you release adrenaline, that adrenaline activates the amygdala, and then the amygdala activates the hippocampus, and that's why you tend to remember what? Very, very emotional memories, whether it's a good one or bad one. Next slide. And actually, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and what they've seen, right, is that, right, when your adrenaline levels are really, really, really low, and then they give you like a memory test, you actually do pretty bad on it. If your adrenaline levels are kind of in a nice, medium, happy level, right, they're high but not too high, you actually do really, really, really good on a memory test. But as we would expect, if adrenaline levels are way, way too high, you end up, right, having really, really, really bad memory. So, again, here's that exercise. There's a lot of commonalities. What goes ahead and increases adrenaline naturally? Exercise. One of the best things that you can do to improve your memory is just to go ahead and right after you've exercised, start reviewing whatever I tell my youth, right? Once you exercise, come back and then start reviewing. Because your adrenaline levels are already actually high. They're high because of the exercise, but that's going to still, your brain doesn't know it, it still activated the amygdala, which is then going to activate your hippocampus, and your memory is going to get stronger. Actually, they did this study over at UCI. What they did is they went ahead and grabbed a whole bunch of undergrad students, and they told them, this is a test on your spelling abilities, how good you can spell. And what they did is they went ahead and grabbed a whole bunch of undergrad students, and then one group, they had them stick their hands in just kind of lukewarm water. And then they had them read this list of words, and then they said, just tell us which words, go down them systematically, tell us which words are misspelled. And then they did that. Okay. They got another group of students, they did the same thing. We're going to test you on how good your spelling ability is, but they stuck their hands in really, really, really cold water and had them do this, right, that task. Remember, students think this is a spelling test. 3 weeks later, they called all the students in, and then they told them, please list all of the words that you remember from 3 weeks ago. They weren't even trying to remember it. What do you think they found? The group that had their hand in what? Really, really, really cold water had what? A whole bunch of memory. Now, for you students out there, don't go, studying in your, put an ice cold bath and study in there, okay? I'm not responsible for frostbite. Okay, but, right. So those adrenaline levels, right, can go ahead and be to your advantage. Next slide. They've actually seen this, right? You go ahead and, I love rats, sorry, okay? Do a whole bunch of experiments on rats. You go ahead and take rats and just inject them. Again, you can see that actually nice curve, like that Yerkes-Dodson law, right? You inject them with enough epinephrine or adrenaline, same thing, right? You go ahead and, right, improve their memory, right? Too much is is not good. Please don't inject yourself with adrenaline, okay? Right, same thing with glucose, right? Those cortisol levels, right? They also go ahead and increase memories. So those are also kind of support them. Next slide. And so one of the things I always tell people to do is as they're trying to, if you have a hard time learning something, right, link it to something, right, with whether it's an emotional word or an emotional picture, and link those two. Okay. So for example, I teach neuroscience, right, and they have to learn a whole bunch of neuroanatomy. And then I always tell them the best way you're going to remember that is if you kind of associate different things and make a visual in your head. So for example, amygdala. What's the amygdala do? We talked about emotions. I always say, just remember, Amy, like amygdala, is a very emotional person. Hippocampus, memory. If you associate, think about a hippo on your campus, right? You're going to remember that, and then, right? So all of these things, right? The best way to remember things is always associate it. If you're really bad at memorizing names, and someone comes, you see a person, right? Put that person's name and associate it with something disgusting. You'll remember it. Okay, guarantee you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. It's known as the testing effect. So they wanted to see which actually helps people remember more. If you reread something over and over and over, or if you test yourself on that material. So same thing what they did. They went ahead and got a group of people, had them read a passage, had them do some math problems just to kind of get their mind off of the passage, and then they split the two groups. One group, right, and they told them, we're going to go ahead and test you after this. One group got to reread the passage. They told them, right, you get to reread the passage. And another group, they said, we don't want you rereading the passage. We just want you to ask yourself, like, what did you read? Right? Then they tested them either 5 minutes later, 2 days later, or a week later. Now let me ask you, if you got to choose which group, would you do the rereading one or the testing one? Most people would say, yeah, I'd want to just reread it so they can like go over it. Okay? Next slide. What they actually found, right, excuse me, is that the ones that reread actually had the ones that were tested had a much better memory. So one of the things, for example, I always try to take the knowledge I get and apply it in the classroom. One of the things students love to do is make their study guide and then just do what? Reread it, go over it, and over it, and over it. In most of my classes, I actually have students do this. I actually tell them, and they almost want to stone me, I tell them I'm not going to put up a study guide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually ask you to go ahead and make a test. So I want you to go ahead and, right, take each lecture and make 5 questions from it. And then what I've done in the past is I've compared the classes where I did give a study guide and the classes where they actually had to come up with their own questions. Who almost always does better? When you come up with your own questions. All right, next slide. All right. Okay. See if you can read this and figure out what's going on. I'll read it for you guys. Okay, if the balloon popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying, since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is that a string could break on the instrument. Then there could be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. Anyone have any idea what's going on? What was that? It's actually... What? Sorry, I can't hear you. Okay. Can you picture, though, what's going on? Okay, go to the next slide. Take a look at this picture. Here's a guy singing. Strings with the balloon, right? And the speaker is what? On top. Good. Okay. Go to the previous slide, not the next slide. Now let me read this again. If the balloon popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying. Does this make now a little bit more sense? This is so much easier to what? Understand. Why? Because you have what? Some context, right? One of the things that I always tell, you can go to the next slide. I'll tell students, tell people, that youth that I work with, right? Always, I know it sucks, but always read before going to class. Because at least, even if it's not assigned, because what happens is when you go to class and now that the teacher is talking about something, you're going to be able to pick up on now what? Details that you would never have been able to what? Pick up before. But once you have a little bit of a like just a foundation, you can be able to what? Pick up on so much more. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's another study, okay? What they went ahead and did is they went ahead and had people memorize. So the group on the left, right, they had students just memorize these paired words, right? Hockey, arena, tree, fruit, bread, wheat. The group on the right, what they did is they said, okay, what you have to do is you have to make up your own word, okay? Even though it's almost kind of this, it's leading the person to even almost put arena, fruit. And you have to come up with your own words, and then same thing, go down and memorize them. And what they found is that the group on the right, the ones who had to what? Come up with their own material, ended up doing a lot better than the ones that are on the left. And to me, this is especially, right, applicable now, because there's Quizlets, there's a whole bunch of things that are online where they what? They do it what? For you. You just got to go download it and then what? Just test yourself. What's the problem with that? You're not generating it yourself. So even if you have to just generate it, even if you end up generating the same thing, you actually do a lot better. And then also very common is, I know this amongst my students, is they'll say, okay, you know what? You do the first half of the study guide, I'll do the second half, you do the middle, and then let's share, and then boom, right, we're all studying, right? Okay, some of you are looking away from me, okay. Okay, all right. So one of the best things that you can go ahead and do is to generate, again, that's known as the generation effect. Same thing, that's the same reason behind I tell my students, you have to generate your own questions for the exam. Okay, next slide. Okay, I get this a lot too. I have students who come to me and say, I don't understand why I did really, really, really bad on the test. I go through my study guide, right, and I go through it several times, so I should be good. And they'll say, well, my friend only went through it 5 times. I went through it 20 times. So given that I went through it 20 times, I should be good. Well, let's see if the number of times that you look at something, if that's correlated with memory. Good? Okay, next slide. How many of you have seen a penny? How many times have you seen a penny? Which one's the correct penny? Only one of those is the correct one. Anyone have a guess which one's the correct? See a hand in the back. Which one? Nope. Actually, I forgot, to be honest, but, okay. I think actually that goes to my point even more, right? Just because what? You see something, I think it's A, right? Someone maybe pull out a pen, right? I think it's A. But, right, that goes to the point. You can see something, what? A billion times, but just because you what? See it a billion times doesn't necessarily mean it's what? Gonna go in your brain. Okay, next slide. All right. So, that's called encoding failure, where it fails to go into long-term memory. And the best way to go ahead and get things to go ahead and go into long-term memory, right, is you start making these associations, you start elaborating, you think about it deeply. Because no one's ever looked at a penny and think, I wonder what this means, right? You don't do that, right? And if you do, I'm sorry, okay, right? Okay, next slide. All right, well, actually, previous slide. All right, let's see. You may have remembered it, but because it was right there. But anyone remember? So I usually do this with my class, right? Just to give them show this point. Anyone remember what the words were where I asked if you were capitalized or not? Was that? Something and no? Okay. How about the word that I said, the girl put the blank on the table? Whoa, you guys did a whole bunch better. And road, why? It doesn't make sense. The one what I asked you, if it was capitalized, you just had to look at what? Its features. The snoring one, you were just looking at sound. But the one that you had to put in the sentence, you actually had to process it and see if it fits in. And you guys, even though you didn't think it was a memory test, most of you got it down more. Okay, next slide. There you go. Those were the words. Blame, no, imploring, bearing, plainting, road. Okay. Next slide. All right. So that's kind of this, what's known as the level of processing theory, is that the more you process words, right, and thoughts, right, the more you're likely to go ahead and remember things. Next slide. Okay. One of the other things, best ways that you can help is in having more retrieval cues. Retrieval cues are things that get associated with the word. And so the more retrieval cues you have, the more likely that something is going to trigger the memory. So for example, I would sometimes have students bring me their study guide, and I would look at their study guide and give them kind of pointers. And so, for example, there's something called sensory memory, working memory, long-term memory. And then I asked them, like on your study guide, know who George Sperling is. And most of the time on the study guide, I would see this. George Sperling was the experimenter who studied sensory memory. Any issues with that? There's going to be like 100 terms on this. That really doesn't stand out. Go to the next slide. Okay. So, what I would actually have them do is change their study guide and say something like this. George Sperling reminds me of George Lucas. Who's George Lucas? Star Wars guys, right? Okay. And all of those senses and all of those things, right? On sensory experiments and how we are bombarded with all kinds of stimuli. And then that little sound clip is the Star Wars beginning. So now you're taking a test, you're worried, right? You see George Sperling. Now that George Sperling is going to trigger? George Lucas, which is then going to trigger what? The memory of sensory. You're much more likely to remember that. Okay, next slide. And I think I'll maybe end on here, okay? So, same thing, one of the best things that you can go ahead and do is memorize or put visuals to pictures. Visuals, make something visual, right? Add visual imagery. So they had two groups of students. one group, right, got to repeat as many pairs as possible. And they just kept on repeating it over and over and over and over and over. And then the other group, they said, okay, you're only going to get to do this once. But what we want you to do is every time you see a word, make a visual in your head of it. So for example, if it was like, a cat and an airplane, just visualize a cat holding on to its dear life on an airplane. Weird, but whatever, it works. Okay? And so, right, you go ahead, and they found that those who only just went through it once but made this imagery, right, had it better. And I'll give you kind of one last example. If you can go to the next slide. Anyone remember from basic biology, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all of that fun stuff? To this day, I still remember it because I just have an image of kangaroos playing chicken on freeways get smashed. Very gruesome, but it gets stuck in your head, right? And there's that kangaroo crossing the freeway. I think that's a good place to stop. Oh, sorry, one thing. What was the structure of the brain that's responsible for memory? Hippocampus, very good, all right.
Okay, so do you understand why he's one of the most revered professors here at Vanguard? Before I start asking you these questions, one of the things, as I've talked to community members about becoming a resource parent, that they tell me is these kids have so many challenges and they're so far behind in school, and I can't even do homework with my own kids. And so when I heard Dr. Light say that you produce 1 billion new cells every hour, and she said, and that's with a B, I just felt so empowered and full of hope. We have the materials to build new pathways. And when I talked to Dr. Hannah about homework and study habits that are ingrained in us, you cannot have dessert until you read this 3 times. And it's like, no. And actually, the day I went to his lecture and he told me to run, it might have been raining, he says, or go watch a scary movie to get your adrenaline up. But the process. So there is great hope. We have to change some of the ways we think about this for these kids who have had so much trauma. We talk about developmental delays and all of those kinds of things. But I love this duo, so because they do give us great hope. So here's some of the questions that have come in. Dr. Light, will it be possible to have access to your slides? And there's another one too. This is a push the button on, yeah.
Do you think I'd be able to do that?
I know.
Yes,
I know.
I'd be happy
Makes
to
me
share.
feel good. Okay, so, and I also, the first time I heard her say billion with a B, I called her almost immediately and said, can I interview? I want evidence for people who have given up hope on these kids. Do you know people who have given up hope on our CSEC kids and others? So this is so important. How can damage to the brain, i.e. concussion, affect the ability to process and have brain growth? Yeah, whichever.
Yeah, I think concussion can be encompassing a whole bunch of brain injury from very, very mild to really very severe. And so I think it's going to depend a lot on the amount of damage. I also think in some ways it's almost more Dr. Hannah's way. Maybe I'm pushing it up, but one of the big things we see with concussion is damage to memory and encoding memory. And so, obviously you could impair the ability to retrain the brain, but I think in some ways with concussion, in addition to emotional ability, we really see a lot of memory issues that would really be the main thing we'd need to work on.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is one of the parts of the brain that we know neurogenesis happens the most is the hippocampus, so that's kind of a good thing. The other thing is it can take time, but that's the beauty about the brain is concussion, it doesn't matter, the brain can recover. You just need to train it. So for example, in people who have strokes, I mean, these are people who maybe in their 80s or 90s, and they're almost completely paralyzed, right? What they, before they would just kind of send them home and just say like, you know what, just live the best life that you can now. But now what they actually do is they take their unparalyzed hand and they actually put a glove on it so that they can't use it. And so what you see is I got these videos, right? And at the very beginning of the session, they're trying to pick up the pen, but they can't even do it. These stroke patients, 80, 90-year-olds. And then within like 9 months, they're fully using their hand, brushing their teeth, right? It just takes time. And you just got to force your brain to kind of use the parts that are not used to it to compensate for it.
Okay, I'm going to ask questions like really fast, quick answers. How do you feel about EMDR to recall repressed memories of traumatic events? I kind of think you covered that.
Maybe. So repressed memory is a whole other ball of wax, and I could do a long talk, but I would say the evidence that I was referring to was really for folks who are actively struggling with known issues. Doesn't mean it couldn't be used in repressed memories, but I think that's a different ball of evidence.
Does being an adrenaline junkie translate into having a great memory?
It helps. It helps, definitely.
I could say that about you. Okay. You've talked a lot about exercise and meditation as good ways to help. What about participation in music and art?
Ooh, great question. I haven't seen a lot of data on brain changes. I have seen data on emotional changes, like improvement in anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it makes a difference. Whether it makes a difference in brain regeneration, I haven't seen the studies yet.
Okay. No. Okay. Does poor memory relate to trauma? What could remedy this issue? It sounds like they already know the answer, so.
I mean, definitely they've seen that with trauma, right? It affects your amygdala, which ultimately affects your hippocampus, and you actually see a shrinkage in the hippocampus. So that is partially, yeah.
But we can exercise the amygdala.
Yes.
Will it help the hippocampus?
Again, I'm not sure to what degree there are two layers. If you can repress things for sure, and so there may be things that you remember later, but I think in terms of encoding new memories, as you grow new cells, absolutely, you can improve as time goes on, and one would hope if you did exercise and meditation and therapy, you should improve as time goes on in terms of your working memory for sure.
We are coming in under the wire. Does diet affect brain function? Beneficial for mental illness?
Yes. Does that mean I live off kale? No. Absolutely. And all those things your grandmother would tell you, whole foods, greens, that makes a huge difference. There are not a lot of hacks. You kind of got to do the work like everything else.
Okay, there's a couple. Somebody said there actually is no evidence that repressed memory occurs. Any comment on that? That was just a comment. So this is a contentious theory. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I was trying to be nice about it, but yeah.
It's 3 o'clock.
I think I definitely think that people may not share on the first visit is perhaps how I would have said.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So as Dr. Sorrell said, if someone comes to you after you've known them a year and says that they were maltreated as a child, believe them. But that doesn't mean the memory is repressed. It just means be alert at any time.
Okay. Are they amazing?